morning, everybody. Happy weekend and happy belated 4th of July. You're listening to the Repcolite Home Improvement Show, sponsored by Benjamin Moore, and this week I put together a greatest hits episode. We're going to be talking about the origins of Yankee Doodle Dandy, we're going to dig into some interesting paint history related to ancient Greek statues, and we're going to talk about a home called the Lindens that's seen over 270 years of history unfold. It's all really great, really interesting stuff. But right now, before we get to that, I want to talk about an old picture that I found of my little girl Hannah, who's 16 now, but at the point she was 2, and she was in the Band-Aid stage. You know what that is, right? It's that stage where every time she gets a cut, she needs a Band-Aid. And really, that part of the stage, the Band-Aid stage, I don't have a problem with. The part that I always had a problem with was when she started needing one every single time she scratched her knee, or every time she got a little bruise. In fact, Hannah really was so exemplary of the Band-Aid stage in all of its aspects that she would need a Band-Aid on the knee where she'd get the red spot, you know, where she'd be kneeling because she bandaged up her other leg. She'd stand up and look down at the knee she had knelt on and see a red spot and start bandaging that leg up too. That's how good she was at the Band-Aid stage. She was a pro. Anyway, she comes out of the bathroom looking like she's wearing all this weird striped colored pants. But in fact, all she had on was a diaper and like 8 gazillion Band-Aids. So I took a picture thinking it was hilarious. And I figured someday, you know, maybe at her wedding or something, I'll crank that out and everybody will have a laugh. Well, it turns out, right after I snapped that picture, somebody hollered from the kitchen, one of the other kids, and asked me where their homework was, or something like that, something they had left on the counter, and we all knew that that meant I had probably thrown it away in an effort to keep the house kind of clean. So, as was usually what happened, I would have to then go and dig through the garbage and try to find it and hope that it didn't have egg whites or egg yolks or spaghetti noodles on it. So anyway, after I take this picture of Hannah, I head to the kitchen to start digging through the garbage to find whoever's homework I might have thrown away. And in the process, I run my hand right across the jagged lid of a can of mushrooms, you know, a tin of mushrooms. Sliced it pretty severely. I could feel it right away. So I yank my hand out of the garbage, clench my hand into a fist, and start running around the kitchen in a panic. You know, assuming that I've probably nicked an artery. You know, I don't know a whole lot about anatomy, and I'm sure there's probably not an artery in my finger. But I assume you always want to assume, you know, big. You know, plan big, and then you can always adjust to that. If you do it the other way, sometimes you might not make it. So anyway, that was my plan. I'm running around the kitchen in a panic because I know I've cut my finger kind of bad. Well, after about 4 loops or so, I make my way to the bathroom. I expand my loops and end up running into the bathroom, trying to find Band-Aids. I completely forgot about Hannah and this picture of the Band-Aid girl. So I whip open the drawer where the Band-Aids go, and I start pawing through the Rubbermaid that's in there, the Rubbermaid full of medical supplies, right? Well, I'm digging through it, and do you think there's any medical supplies in that thing at all? No. All there are thousands of Band-Aid wrappers and then millions of those little slippery plastic Band-Aid things that go over the sticky part. Yeah, the drawers are full of those, but absolutely no Band-Aids. Anyway, I'm pawing through the drawer, starting to get a little woozy. You know, I look down at my hand as I still got it clenched, and I see that it almost looks gray and wrinkly, like it's mummifying right in front of me. I figure I'm bleeding out as I'm watching. So I return to the little Band-Aid bin with renewed vigor to try to find something to staunch the flow of blood. Well, anyway, as I'm doing that, pawing through quickly, of course, I paw my way right into the pointy end of a tweezers. And that jabs itself right in the little flappy skin area between my pointer finger and my middle finger. So now I've got a brand new amount of pain. I yank my hand out of that little bin and hit my elbow on the wall because the bathroom's small. Now I've got this tingling running up and down my arm. I assumed it was a heart attack. I didn't think to put 2 and 2 together. It was probably just the injury from hitting my elbow on the wall. I slumped to the floor and the bin fell over. And it was at that point that I noticed one last Band-Aid that had not been discovered by Hannah. And as I reached for it, ripped it open with my mouth, I felt like somebody in a war movie. I put it on my little finger, staunched the flow of blood. Everything was good. Right at that point, Hannah comes into the room. I remember this as clear as it was yesterday. She looks at me with utter disgust and disdain as I put on that little Hello Kitty Band-Aid on my finger. And then she pointed. She didn't say anything. She just pointed at a new little red spot on her ankle, shook her head at me, and walked away. Yeah. All of that comes back to me when I look at this picture. So what can I take out of that? What's the point of talking about it? I don't know. I guess one thing is this: parents, young parents, all of us, make the most out of all of these crazy and sometimes completely frustrating experiences with our kids. It really is stunning. And anybody, who's my age, who's got kids who are 19, 20 on down, anybody in that situation will tell somebody with younger kids that hold on to these memories because they just fly. These years with the kids fly by. And I know when people told me that, when I had kids who were Hannah's age 2 at that point, I remember thinking, really? They're going to fly by? I don't think so, because it feels like this incredible slog just to get through this past week with the kids. And you're telling me that it's going to fly by? It does. I don't know how it works. I don't know how that happens, but I cannot believe that all of these things are that far in the past. So hold on to them, because even as frustrating as they are, I can promise you're going to look back. I can't promise anything, because if you lost an arm because you couldn't get the Hello Kitty Band-Aids because your daughter had used them on her leg on red spots, maybe there's no happy ending to that story. But in most of them, you're going to look back, and as frustrating as they were at the time, they're going to be hilarious. So enjoy them while you can. Make the most of them while you can. That's one thing. The other thing you can take out of that, and it's very practical, keep a stocked first aid kit in your home at all times. If you do any kind of work around the house, if you're remotely leaning towards the clumsy side, even if you're not, first aid kit. You can find them online. You can find them anywhere. Do a little research. Get a good one. Keep it in your home and keep it stocked. All right, there you go. Some light stuff and some really eminently practical stuff to get us moving. We're going to take a break right now, and when we come back, we're talking about one of the oldest homes in the country. That's all just ahead. Stick around. You're listening to a special 4th of July Greatest Hits episode of the Repcolite Home Improvement Show, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. Anyway, I ran into an interesting article on the internet the other day, and I thought I'd talk about it. It was an article on Architectural Digest's website, and the article was entitled, "Inside the Oldest House in Washington, D.C." Now, the article focuses on a home called the Lindens. It's a 3-story residence that sits on one of the largest lots in Kalorama, Washington, D.C. Now, it's a house with a build date of 1754. It predates the Revolutionary War. But that's just the beginning. There's way more to the story than that. Now, the house was built for Robert King Hooper. He was a leading ship owner, a merchant, and here's the fun fact. Here's the thing that really sets this house apart from almost anything out there. It was built in Danvers, Massachusetts, 457 miles from where it is right now. Here's the story. Robert King Hooper, he was a Tory. He sympathized with Britain. He was commonly called king because of his kingly fortune and to project his wealth and his social stature. We drive cars and stuff like that tell everybody about what we've achieved in our life. I drive a Ford Transit Connect to let everybody know that I have made it. I have arrived. You got to use the key to open the little flap where you put gas in. You got to use the key to open the hood. It's pretty top-notch. Ford Transit Connect. That's how I convey my wealth and social stature. Robert King Hooper decided to build an enormous, massive mansion. So he had the Lindens built in 1754. It was a huge New England Georgian townhouse, all right? It took its name from the trees lining the long drive. There's the beginning. Now, spring 1774. We're drawing closer to the Revolutionary War. General Thomas Gage, who's the commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America, is appointed the governor of Massachusetts, all right where the home is. Now, since Hooper was a loyalist, Gage made the Lindens the headquarters of the Loyalist cause in Massachusetts, and he actually dwelt there for a period of time. Now, if you know anything, even a little, about the Revolutionary War, you're going to notice that you recognize Gage's name, if nothing else. His enforcement of some of the king's decrees actually brought the colonists to the point of insurrection. He was clumsy or heavy-handed. He just couldn't or wouldn't make these things politically expedient. He just hammered the colonists over and over, and it drove everybody to the point of revolution and anger in Massachusetts. Now, there's actually a bullet hole in the heavy front door of the Lindens from a shot taken during this time period when this was the headquarters of the Loyalist cause. All right, as the war unfolds, Hooper loses his social footing. All his fortune, all his standing in the community, it crumbles away. His ties to England certainly didn't help him, and he loses the home to creditors. Now, flash ahead, a century and a half later, the house has been through a number of owners, and by the 1930s, a couple of antique dealers buy it and begin kind of starting to strip it down. They sell an entire room of paneling off to a museum. And people around the home fear that it's going to get stripped clean. Preservation societies who are aware of it are concerned that this thing is just going to be stripped completely bare or razed to the ground, just destroyed, because the area around it starts to deteriorate. And it's the last standing, I think I read one of the articles referred to it at that period as an oasis amongst all the waste of the area. And people were concerned that this great historical monument, to some extent, is going to be just trashed. Well, the antique dealers don't continue to sell the house off, and they don't raze it to the ground. Instead, they sell it to a couple named George and Miriam Morris in 1934. See, George and Miriam had actually been looking for a period house to show off their collection of early American furniture. They had one of the most renowned, if not the most renowned, collection of early American furniture around, and they wanted the right setting to show it off and highlight it. Their original plan was to build a historical replica in Washington, D.C., where they came from. But the stock market crash really kind of put that out of the picture, and they realized that buying a true historical home that was in need of repair and renovation and moving that home to where they wanted it was actually more economically feasible than building a new one. So they scoured the country looking around for the right house. They had a certain area that they wanted it to come from. They checked it out. They found this house and bought the Lindens for about $14,000, again, in 1934. Then the fun process came of disassembling the entire thing painstakingly, numbering each single piece, and then loading them all up on 6 railroad cars and then shipping them from Danvers, Massachusetts, 457 miles to Washington, D.C. There, it was reassembled on a concrete foundation, and they added, modern electrical services, indoor plumbing, things like that. What's interesting is that even with these modern additions, Miriam Morris worked very hard to make sure that they were hidden when people would actually come through the house. The radio, for example, I believe she had a compartment built into the bookcase that would house and hide the radio, keep it out of sight. I believe she did that with the telephone, and any modern convenience was hidden away in the home so that when you toured it or looked at it, you saw none of those things. You only saw the home as it was meant to be. The entire process of rebuilding that house and getting it to exactly what Miriam Morris wanted took about 3 years and really was considered one of the finest historical restorations to that date. And even beyond, it's still considered one of the best. Since then, the home has gone through a number of owners, and the current owners, as mentioned in that Architectural Digest article, just recently did a major renovation. There were many sagging parts of the home. After a couple hundred years, homes tend to do that, right? So they fixed up some of those things, changed some of the aspects of the home, but still tried to stay true to the historical nature and quality of the home, even incorporating color schemes that, while new, still had some of that older feel. So it doesn't feel like a completely modern retake. It's still got that old classic feel of the 1754 house that it was. So all of that has happened. It's an amazing story. And when I think about that, I think about how few of us, I can't think of anybody really, none of us have a house with the history and stories of a home like the Lindens. None of us can boast that the infamous General Gage from the Revolutionary War stayed in our homes as a tenant, or that our home was around to witness the birth of the nation. We may look at our home and it may feel like it's been around that long because it's falling apart so badly, but none of them have been around that long. It's staggering to think about the fact that this home was there through all of that. There's a great and admittedly somewhat sappy song. It's written by Glenn Campbell, but my favorite version of it is by Sean Colvin. It's called If These Walls Could Speak. I'm sure most of you have heard that. If you haven't, it's really worth a listen. But the concept, whether you've heard it or not, is simple enough to grasp. The walls of our homes would tell a story if they could only speak, right? And what's gut-level honest about the song is the fact that the walls wouldn't only tell stories about the good times. They see it all. They see the good and they see the bad. They see the fights and the laughter. They see the children bickering with each other. They see the dad who just wants to watch the A-Team and eat his bowl of Lucky Charms. They see the children continue to fight while the dad is begging them to stop. And then they see the dad trying to solve the problem and then spilling his Lucky Charms and missing the A-Team. The walls see all of those things, the good and the bad. And that's true of every single one of our homes. No matter what your home looks like, no matter how big, how small, how, updated, how out of date, every single home tells a story. We don't have Thomas Gage staying in the home, right? None of us do. At least, I hope not. Because if you do, it's probably time for a paranormal team or maybe an exorcist or something like that. Get him out. He shouldn't be there anymore. Most of our homes aren't the stopping places of famous visitors. They're not places where the rich and powerful hang out. But actually, they're lived in by people who are far more important, at least to us. Our homes are housing our families. They're places where we raised or are raising our children. They're the places where we gather on Christmas mornings, Easters, Thanksgivings. They're where we sit around the table, eating dinner, laughing about something stupid that we did at work or at school that day. They're the places where we sit out on the deck and talk about the drama and the pitfalls and the heartache of teenage love. Oh my goodness, the drama of teenage love. I never, ever was prepared for all of that drama. But anyway, our houses are the places where we bring home our first puppy, where we decorate our first baby room, and we give our kids' rooms that big kid update that they all need after a while. They're the places where some of our most important stories really take place, and every single home has a story to tell. Now, if you're anything like me, one of the most frustrating things when it comes to reading a story about the Lindens or watching some of these amazing shows and homes on cable television channels is that we see these homes that are beautifully restored. They're palatial, they're immaculate. And we look at our own home and we think, man, this doesn't hold a candle to those. Our homes don't hold half the interest. They don't hold half the appeal, half the stature, half the beauty. And you know what? They don't, right? They don't. Here's the thing, though. They hold something better, at least to some extent. They hold the memories and the stories of our families. Now, that doesn't mean never move. You've got to expand and move beyond when the time is right. The stories follow. The memories remain. It's not like they're locked into that place. But the point that I guess I'm trying to get at is that we should never forget that there is a certain beauty in the simplicity of even our little average homes, our less than perfect porches, our cramped little bathrooms, even our Michigan basements. Sometimes a move just isn't in the budget. And when that happens, from my own personal experience, I know the tendency is to feel a little bit trapped. We see homes in magazines and on those shows like I was talking about, and it makes ours look and feel like a third-place runner-up in a two-person contest, right? If you find yourself in that boat, when you hear about a house like the Lindens or you see something amazing in an Architectural Digest magazine, just take a quick second and remember your home is filled with your stories. And while it may not be perfect, it can always be better. Now, from a home improvement point of view, there's absolutely nothing that's going to transform a home as quickly or economically as a new coat of paint. You can give a Michigan basement a clean feel. You really can, with white paint on those block walls, very inexpensively. A new color scheme on your living room walls, new paint on your kitchen cabinets, a bold color maybe on a built-in, a whitewash over that 70s brick fireplace. Any or all of those projects can give you a new canvas to work on and really make your space feel like it's brand new. It may not feel palatial, but it's definitely going to improve what you think you've got. Now, all right, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're talking about a fascinating historical fact about Greek statues of all things. It's going to make sense in a little bit, I promise. Just stick around. You're listening to a special 4th of July Greatest Hits episode of the Repcolite Home Improvement Show, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And this particular segment that I'm going to play right now goes back a long, long way, back to 2019. And the other voice you're going to hear is my original co-host, Betsy Thompson. Well, Betsy, I love digging into history stuff. I love digging into current events. I love digging into all of that stuff. And every now and then, I've run into things. I can think back on maybe 3 or 4 of them where the common understanding, at least my common understanding of how this or that event occurred, how that is actually incorrect. And it's a really it's what do they call that? Paradigm shifting, right?
I would say so for sure.
Yeah, the idea is that I understood something, I thought it was accepted, and then I realized, wait a minute, there's another side that I hadn't really considered before. And I ran into one of those things working on the Repcolite webpage. You know, I was writing a blog. This was way before you were even around here. And I ran into this idea that apparently all of these Greek and Roman sculptures that we can all imagine, right? Everybody right now, just imagine the Greek and Roman sculptures. You know, everything that you know of. Imagine those.
Right.
I can't tell you what scenes you're imagining or what particular sculptures you're imagining, but I can tell probably with 98% accuracy that everybody out there is picturing white marble.
Well, that's what we've all been taught. You know, in school, you learned about Greek and Roman statues, and you saw pictures in your textbooks, and you learned about them in art class, and they were always just white marble statues. And the thinking was that, you know, the white marble showed the human form. It got to gut level. You know, there was nothing to distract you. This was humanity at its purest form. I mean, that's what was at least drilled into my head.
That's what we've been taught.
Right.
But it turns out, ever since the late 90s, early 2000s, it's been proven that that's not the case at all. These sculptures were actually painted.
Yeah.
And painted in hideous colors.
Well, they were painted in
They were hideous. But art is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
So we don't need to go into that. Back in the day, maybe everybody loved them. But they were painted. That's the point. That's what I want to drill into. So how did we get such a misunderstanding of how things were? Well, let's go back and talk about that. The whole myth, let's call it, of the white marble statues basically started during the Renaissance, when we first started unearthing some of these ancient statues and digging them up and finding them, discovering them wherever they found them. Of course, time had worn off most of that original paint.
Right.
So they found them as we kind of think of them. And as the centuries went by, and the artists in the 16th century, they saw that bare stone and they began to emulate it.
Yeah, people like Michelangelo, of course, they thought that this was the ancient aesthetic and they wanted to copy it. You know, it's a Renaissance, so that's the kind of thing that they did. And so they made their statues and then left them bare. Whether it was marble or bronze, they just left it.
Right. And then after the Renaissance, the Neoclassicism started in the 18th century. And basically the idea behind Neoclassicism was they wanted new classics of the highest rank. So it arose in opposition to the more gaudy Baroque styles of art. And people started to want art and architecture that mirrored the idealized work and standards of the Greeks and Romans. You know, we see even now all of our, well, not all of our, we talked about this a few months ago, but lots of our state buildings, our federal buildings, all reflect this same idea. It's stately. It's, you know, an idealized standard. So in the Neoclassicism, when that started, that's what they were looking at. And Betsy, I don't remember when we talked about the Grand Tour, but that's kind of what started this.
Yeah, anyone who has Amazon probably knows that there's a show on Amazon right now called The Grand Tour. Completely different than what these grand tours are, but it's along the same lines. You know, you do some traveling. It used to be for the younger men. It was kind of a rite of passage, and you just traveled through Europe. And of course, Rome was one of the huge destinations. You had to get there. You had to see the classics. You know, you had to be inspired and be worldly. So that's kind of where the whole idea came from.
Exactly. So they go around, they travel. It's 3 to 5 years of traveling, and they see all these Greek and Roman sculptures that are white marble. And it becomes embedded in our in the psyche of everybody. That is what art was. And so they embrace that idea. Neoclassicism really takes off. Well, the idea continues of white marble as the ideal into the 18th century, where even more sculptures begin to be unearthed. However, because of weathering and all of that, they've lost loads and loads of the paint. But we started to discover evidence that there was color. Now, some of it got removed by well-intentioned archaeologists who were cleaning the pieces off. They just brushed it away.
Yeah.
But here's where it starts to get really interesting. Some of it was just ignored.
Yes.
And it was ignored because it didn't match our perception of what beauty was.
Right.
Johann Winkelmann, which is a tremendously fun name to say. you know you're going places when you're named Johann Winkelmann.
Yes.
Of course, he did something that is, I don't know. I don't know that we can make a judgment call on it, but he's considered by many to be the father of art history.
Yeah.
He wrote the book on ancient art, let's say. But even though he was aware of the historical evidence for color in these pieces, he downplayed it in his writings.
Yeah.
And that ends up getting into our understanding of what art was. He basically whitewashed history because he didn't like the idea of color on statues.
Right. And other people were writing about some of the things that were being unearthed because there was a really great discovery that happened. I can't remember exactly when it was, but they were going through all of the things in Pompeii after, about Vesuvius, and they found a statue that was painted that they could see the color on still, that had been very well preserved because of the volcanic ash and things like that. And so here's this thing staring at them in the face that says, hey, sculptures were not white. They had these beautiful, brilliant colors to them, but people ignored it.
Because it didn't fit with the narrative.
Right.
Very, very, very interesting. And it shaped how we understand everything. Well, anyway, let's move ahead into the late 1900s and early 2000s. That's when let's call it the breakthrough happens. German archaeologist and professor Vincent Brinkmann starts using ultraviolet light because in looking at some of these pieces in museums and stuff, he saw visual evidence of color.
Right.
And so he decided to dig into this a little deeper, and using ultraviolet light at a very low angle, basically raking across the piece, he exposed color and pattern that was invisible to the naked eye.
Right. The paint served two purposes on these statues. It protected them, but it also decorated them, and it made them more lifelike. And for statues that were on great buildings back in the day, if you painted them, you could see them from further away, which was one of the reasons that they were painting them, so that as you came up to a building, you could really see these statues that were there. And they also had some other crazy things. There's one statue that has curls in her hair, and they said that they could find the pinholes where the curls actually had been put on there so that they would gently blow in the breeze to make it more lifelike. Yeah, so they used the paint and these other techniques to make it more lifelike and real.
Very cool.
Yeah.
But what happened is the paint that's on there, like Betsy was saying, it's meant to protect. That's what paint does.
Yeah.
It decorates and it protects. Those are its two main functions. Well, when it wore off over time, and some of it wore off faster than others, right? Certain tones wore off faster, certain mixes wore off faster. But the parts of the pieces that stayed protected longer actually look different when viewed under ultraviolet light. You can see the dips where some of it weathered a little more and some of it was protected longer. So Brinkmann finds all this and realizes that they're not just painted in solid colors. They're painted in all kinds of crazy patterns too.
Yes.
And he creates this exhibit that's been traveling the world for quite a while now, right? 10, 15 years?
Yeah, since 2003. Yeah. It's called Gods in Color, and there's a website that you have to go and check out. We'll have a link in the show notes. It shows all of these sculptures, and it's also cool because they show the different variations. As technology, has gone forward, we have new ways of looking at these things, and so they're changing what the colors are, what the patterns are. They're adding, they're taking away. And so it's interesting to see, where they started and the different variations that they've come up with as our technology has progressed.
Right. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, along with some other stuff that you want to check out. And yes, the modern reaction to these things is usually going to be that we'll see them as gaudy and garish and over the top. That's just
Right.
our reaction. But the thing is, it is so important to understand when we think of ancient Rome, when we think of ancient Greece, we all have these images of these pristine white sculptures that are everywhere. Expunge that from your mind, because that's not what it was.
Right.
It was crazy. It was color everywhere. In fact, I found a great quote that said, "Suddenly, a world that we'd been used to regarding as austere and reflective has been turned on its head to become as jolly as a circus."
It is
as
true.
Jolly as a circus.
It is true.
That's what the ancient world was like.
Right.
And anyway, if any of this is new to you and you're having a hard time believing it, here's one last quote to take with you. It's attributed to Helen of Troy, and it's written by Euripides in 412 BC. And here's the quote: "If only I could shed my beauty." Well, you know what? It's attributed to Helen of Troy. Betsy, I don't think a dude should be reading this. Take it away.
All right. So Helen of Troy said, "If only I could shed my beauty and assume an uglier aspect, the way you would wipe color off a statue."
Wiping color off a statue. In Euripides' estimation, that was to make the statue as ugly as possible.
Right.
Strange to think that we consider the height of beauty unadorned classical statues, whereas the people then figured that if it's not caked over with color, it's just not worth it.
Right.
Bottom line, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And when your daughter-in-law tells you that green that you're using is so 1970s, hey, beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Clearly.
Do what you want, right?
Right.
Everything will be in the show notes. You want to check it out. Now, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I've got the origin story of the Yankee Doodle Dandy song. That's all just ahead. Stick around. And we're back. You're listening to the Repcolite Home Improvement Show, sponsored by Benjamin Moore, and we're working our way through a Greatest Hits 4th of July episode. Did you notice anything new, different?
Yes, I noticed how patriotic you are today.
I am just
Your
toe-tapping.
choice of music is just...
the fife and drum.
Yeah, you're really getting into this 4th of July thing, aren't you?
And I have a reason for it.
Okay.
But we're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Oh, okay.
But first, why don't you tell everybody about your little experiment with something you talked about a few weeks ago?
Yes. I was out doing a little bit of weeding in a shaded area. I was about to move a hosta and thought I better get the weeds out before I move the hosta. And all of a sudden I feel that, undescribable pick and it right in my arm. And of course there's a mosquito.
Yes, mosquitoes.
And
I would have said the unmistakable whine in my ear, but then...
No, it was like that, needle jabbing you right through the bicep. I thought, this is for the birds. They're just going to eat me alive out here. So ran to the porch, and I did, in fact, plant some bee balm in a pot.
Bee balm.
Bee
That's
balm.
really fun to say. Bee balm.
Yes, that was closer than the lavender.
Bee balm.
Yes. I just snapped off a little branch of it, and I just rubbed it all over my arms, all over my legs, my back, anything where I was going to potentially end up with mosquito bites. And I did not end up with a single mosquito bite, and that is amazing because usually I attract mosquitoes like crazy.
Right. So a few weeks ago, you talked about a bunch of natural mosquito repellents.
Yeah.
And this was your first opportunity to put it to the test, and it passed with flying colors.
Yeah, and I didn't smell like bug spray, which was a huge bonus.
No,
I smelled like bee balm.
Smelled like sweat and bee balm.
Kind of lemony almost. It's a good smell.
Yeah.
I much prefer it to the other stuff.
It was really cool. That was cool to hear that it worked.
Yeah, I was very excited.
It's fun to hear that we weren't incorrect in what we were recommending.
No, we were not.
Now, let's get back to the music that started the show.
To your very patriotic attitude
Well,
today?
that's what's funny. Yankee Doodle, right?
Yes.
It's the quintessential
Yeah, kids learn it when you're like in
patriotic song.
elementary school.
Right.
Yeah.
And I remember that. And one of the things that I remember,
Yes.
and maybe I was just dumber than most of the rest of the children, which is entirely possible. Let's just leave it there. It's possible. But anyway, every time we had to sing this little song, in my head, I play through the line. I can't remember the line.
Stuck a feather in
Went
his cap.
to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. Made no sense to me. Makes no sense at all. All I could picture is he's running around with macaroni and cheese on his hat.
I think
What
most kids think that.
is the point?
Right.
Well, the thing is, we did a little research. And again, maybe we're dumber than most. Maybe most of you already know this. But there's a whole history behind the song. And there's so many interesting things. Like, first off, the song, while it is considered quintessentially patriotic,
Right.
was actually created for the opposite purposes by the British, right? I mean, or they took the song
Right.
and put their own lyrics to it to make fun of
Right.
the colonists who were at war.
Right.
You know, because that's what you do. I mean, you kill people, but
Right.
you also make fun of them
Then
as
you
much
make
as
fun
you
of
can.
them to make
or
them
you
feel
make fun
really
of them
bad.
first and then makes it easier. I think that was the plan.
Right.
But anyway, so what does this mean? Yankee Doodle.
'Kay.
Well, first off, Yankee, of course. We know where that comes
Yes.
from. Doodle was just meant to be some kind of country bumpkin. You know, that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
So he goes to town, and he's riding on what, Betsy?
A pony.
A pony. Not a real horse.
No.
Remember
a
how
little
many
pony.
How many times do I talk about riding anything, and it's always
Yes,
a pony?
right.
That's what I always think
Yes,
of.
it is.
So yes, this
Generally a miniature
it's
pony.
meant to- well, they're the only ones that I can get on without needing a box to get
Right,
up on them.
right.
Anyway, so he's riding to town on his Shetland pony.
Uh-huh.
And he sticks a feather in his cap and calls it macaroni. All right,
Yes.
so that's where it kind of breaks down.
Uh-huh.
But what's interesting
Yeah.
is that in Britain, in Europe, there's this point where this coming of age thing during this time period,
Yeah.
where young men or the young people would travel the world.
Yeah.
And they
a
started
grand tour.
Right, a grand tour is
Yep.
what it was called. They will come back, and now they're appropriating lots of different fashion elements that they've seen
Right.
throughout their travels. And
Yeah.
it's basically their way of demonstrating how worldly, how sophisticated they are.
Right.
And the thing is, what they did was they really, really dandied themselves up.
Yes.
Right? So great big wigs and big fluffy clothes. I mean, picture the French Revolution stuff, the elite, the monarchy with
Right.
all the makeup and the powder and all of that. That's what they're starting to do. There's
Right.
this movement in Britain
Right.
that this is happening. And it was very shocking,
Right,
for the
right.
rest of the Brits.
Yes.
They see this group, these young people.
What
with
are
their
they thinking?
Fancy get up. Well, anyway, what they eventually came to be called was the macaroni.
Right.
I think part of it was because that was one of their favorite foods that they came up with, right? I think I read that.
Yes.
Anyway, whatever the reason for the name, that's what they're called.
Yeah.
So, back to the song. Yankee Doodle sticks a feather in his hat. He can't get all fancy.
Right.
And he thinks that he's macaroni now. He thinks he is the elite.
He thinks he's been on the grand tour and he's sophisticated.
Right. It is a complete slam of who we are. So that's where the song comes from.
Right.
But what's really fun is this funny little twist, this little irony that history has a way of bringing about.
Right.
Is when Cornwallis surrenders to Washington at Yorktown in 1781. He's greeted by the colonists singing this song because we adopted it at that point.
Right.
And we completely appropriated it and threw it back in his face when they surrendered.
Well,
How awesome is
apparently
that?
we appropriate a lot of songs because if you think about, if you have ever heard the song that they play in Britain, God Save the Queen or God Save the King, depending on what they have, it's a song from like 1741, something like that. Well, if you think of patriotic songs and start singing to yourself, My Country 'Tis of Thee, you will find that they have exactly the same tune.
Did we steal that on purpose?
Well, the gentleman charged with writing the lyrics to that song in 1831, almost 100 years after the tune was put out there, he did not know that that was the song that they play for British royalty.
Oh, he didn't know. That's even better.
He did not know.
So he just happens to, okay.
Yeah, they give him this piece of music and they say, write lyrics for this, and this is what he comes up with.
Did they tell him to write a patriotic song?
Yes, I believe so. Yep. And then
So
they had some
somebody-
school children singing.
Somebody was
and-
aware.
Yes, and it
Somebody
was
was
like
having a
for a
laugh.
4th of July celebration, I believe, the first time they brought it out. So
That is really fun.
yeah, so we like to take British songs and kind of, make them our own.
Yeah, so we're going to take a couple Beatles songs and make those
Yep.
the new Repcolite Home Improvement Show theme songs.
Might as well.
Yeah. I'm a loser. Right? That's the first. That was my son's walk-up song in baseball on the high school team. His first year.
Okay.
That was the song he chose. I thought that was
Wow.
brilliantly funny. Music.
Brings us all together.
It brings us all around. Anyway, that's all the time we've got. We're going to wrap it up. I hope you have a great holiday weekend, and I'll see you next week. I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.